a major agreement on energy.
The memorandum of understanding that we're negotiating with Alberta creates necessary conditions, but not sufficient conditions, because we believe in cooperative federalism.
This is what Team Canada looks like, that when you've got provinces that don't have access to a shoreline, we cooperate to make sure that we can get our products to market.
I underlined for the Prime Minister how unacceptable it was to me to have Saskatchewan and Alberta speaking about matters in British Columbia without British Columbia at the table.
That is how the scene has been set up leading up to today in a nutshell. This morning, the federal government and government of Alberta are set to sign what they're calling a memorandum of understanding on energy and climate, Ottawa's initial response to Alberta's pursuit of a new bitumen pipeline to BC's northern coast, something that, as you heard in that clip, BC's premier vehemently opposes. I'm going to show you a live look now where Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith and Prime Minister Mark Carney are expected to meet each other. There's, you can see the floor there. I promise you the camera's going to move up in a moment. As soon as they meet, we are expecting each of them to make some initial remarks, and then we'll be able to take you to the room that I believe we, at some other point, will have a live shot of, where they are actually going to formally sign this memorandum of understanding. I want to bring in my colleague, senior political correspondent Michael Couture, who has been tracking all the developments, because there's a lot to unpack, Mike. First of all eyes set on what exactly is explicitly detailed. Like, when we're talking about the prospect of a pipeline, how explicit will the federal government's support of this project be? And the response to that, not just from the Premier of British Columbia, but around the cabinet table, is also kind of got Ottawa abuzz right now.
Yeah, exactly. And the question as to whether or not certain cabinet ministers who have been very pro-environment, one looks no further than Stephen Guilbeault. There's been some reporting out there that he is firmly in cabinet. Jonathan Wilkinson as well, former Natural Resources Minister, and how they feel about this entire MOU, this Memorandum of Understanding, and whether or not any red lines have been crossed in that MOU. That, I think, is going to be something that we're going to be looking for. The reporting has been that Stephen Guilbeault, up until this point, is firmly in cabinet and on board with Team Carney. Whether or not some of the details of this change that calculation for him, that's unclear right now. But I think, to the point that you're also making on what this sketches out and how this actually lays the groundwork for it, that clip from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons, very clear on saying that this will be essentially laying out a path to it and sort of the markers that have to be hit in order to get that pipeline. Not exactly saying that, yes, this is about the pipeline, but making sure that everybody understands what the pathway is to that. And in the past, he has talked about how Pathways 2 is part of that. That is that carbon capture program that goes northwards from around Cold Lake, Alberta. So these are the types of things that I think we're expected to see in all of this.
I'm just going to interrupt you, Mike, because let's take a listen in live now as the Prime Minister and Premier of Alberta meet.
You've been so busy. I've been watching your schedule. I thought I had a busy one, but my goodness, you do. It's nice to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Shall I say a few words?
You want me to start?
Why don't you start? You're hosting. So.
Well, thank you to the Prime Minister for being here today. And this is a really great day for Albertans. We have been working for some time on addressing the 9 bad laws, as I like to call them, that have been impacting our investment climate here. And I'm pleased that we've reached an agreement to substantially work on removing and revising those laws. I think what it's going to do, especially with the removal of the emissions cap on Alberta, as well as the removal of the net zero power regs, I think it's going to unleash an incredible amount of investment and allow us to work together on important nation-building projects. So it's the first step, I think, of what will be a few more steps we have to take together, but I'm very pleased that the Prime Minister has heard our concerns and responded to them.
Thank you very much, Premier. And look, it's a great day for Alberta. It's a great day for Canada. And you know, at the heart of what is a multifaceted agreement, we have more work to do going forward, but a multifaceted agreement. In effect, it creates an energy transition, all aspects of energy, but really sets the stage for an industrial transformation. At the core of the agreement, of course, is a priority to have a pipeline to Asia. That's going to make Canada stronger, more independent, more resilient, more sustainable, because the way we're going to do that is in combination with the Pathways project, which will be the largest carbon capture project in the world. It'll mean that Alberta barrels of bitumen are amongst the lowest energy intensive in the world, therefore competitive not just for tomorrow, but for decades, as well as creating a whole new industry for Alberta and for Canada. In addition, agreements, or at least intentions around nuclear power, interties with other provinces, sovereign data centers, huge opportunity, huge necessity for Alberta and for Canada. And it's all done in a spirit of cooperation, partnership, and trust. So as the Premier just referenced, some adjustments to regulations, adjustments here in terms of strengthening the tier system, methane regs, enhancing methane regs, a cooperation agreement on regulation, which will help us move forward more efficiently and effectively. And also, just on the point of cooperation, at the heart of this is cooperation, partnership with Indigenous peoples in Alberta, in British Columbia, as they're affected. Unprecedented opportunities for Indigenous ownership, partnership, economic benefits, as well as substantial economic benefits for the people of British Columbia. So this is Canada working. This is cooperative federalism. This is Canada building with Alberta, building with Canada, building for today, but building very much for the future. And I'm very grateful, Premier, for your hard work and the hard work of your team to get us to this point. We've got more work to do, but we're going to work hard to do it. Et puis en français, oh mon Dieu.
It's a great pleasure to be coming back here to Alberta. I grew up here in Alberta. It's a good day for Canada, for the province, but also for Canada. This agreement will make Canada more independent, more resilient, and stronger, and more sustainable. At the heart of this agreement is a pipeline to BC, but that will be in combination with a new major project, the Pathway project, the largest carbon storage project in the world. This will be a new industry for Canada and for Alberta. Consequently, we will have Alberta's bitumen that is the cleanest and most competitive in the world.
Ce sera une atteinte incroyable.
This will be an incredible achievement. There are other aspects of this agreement as well, also touching on nuclear energy and the connections and systems between the provinces. So this represents an industrial transformation for the future. And finally, at the heart of this agreement is cooperation. Cooperation between Alberta and the federal government, and cooperation with BC, and especially cooperation and partnership with the Indigenous peoples. These will be great opportunities that are unprecedented, opportunities to have economic benefits from these projects. There's a lot of work to be done, but today is a good day. It's good news for Canada, because Canada works when we have cooperative federalism. And lastly, I'd like to thank the Premier for your hard work.
All right, you're watching special coverage in Calgary, Alberta there of Premier Danielle Smith, Alberta's Premier, and Prime Minister Mark Carney making initial comments before they actually sign this Memorandum of Understanding, providing some clarity on what exactly this Memorandum of Understanding will entail, including, as the Prime Minister said, very specifically giving priority to have a new pipeline to transport Alberta bitumen to additional markets in Asia. So that had been the central ask of the Premier. Also, the ask that had proven to be the most divisive with BC's Premier, David Eby. So that will certainly be something to talk about. And then also the Premier of Alberta saying that the agreement entails the removal of the emissions cap. So the federal government had brought into place, and it was set to come into effect, an emissions cap on the oil and gas sector. She said that will no longer be a part of the plan going forward, and then also amendments to the targets that had been set to have the Alberta electricity grid reach net zero. So I don't know the details of exactly how that changes, but she basically said that there will be major changes to both those things, and she talked about the removal of the emissions cap. The Prime Minister in turn referenced methane regulations, so gave indication that that's a part of this MOU, as well as the tier system, so the industrial carbon price. Sources had told us in the lead up to this MOU that this agreement would involve strengthening that carbon price, and that's certainly something that had been put in the budget, though no details on what the new industrial carbon price would be. We'll take a look live now as the Premier and the Prime Minister and their teams meet with each other. I can see the Premier's Chief of Staff to her left, in Energy, Federal Energy Minister Tim Hodgson to the right of the Prime Minister, and they're ushering our cameras out. A perfect time for me to usher in three fantastic analysts who can help us talk a little bit about what this means ahead of the formal signing. As soon as that document, I should say, is formally signed, we will be able to report all the details of it. With me right now to talk about that is Scott Reid. He's a CTV News political analyst and former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Corey Tonight was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And former NDP MP and BC Minister Nathan Cullen is with us. He's a senior advisor at Strategy Corp. Hi, everybody. Great to have you here this morning ahead of this very significant event. So Scott, some more detail than I anticipated there from the Prime Minister and the Premier about what's in this. I thought the language that really stuck out to me was the Prime Minister saying that the federal government would be, through this agreement, giving priority to a pipeline carrying Alberta bitumen to the West Coast. What do you take from that?
Yeah, first of all, I'm with you. It sounds, just in terms of their shorthand characterization of it, that it's a relatively detailed, relatively extensive MOU. So I'll be interested to see the actual content. It doesn't sound like they've just left all the small print for down the road. But, you know, to me, a couple of things jumped out of what the Prime Minister said. I mean, he's really straining. You could hear him there to characterize this as a win-win. That on the one hand, we're going to get a pipeline to Asia. That provides us with energy independence. They might as well have been hanging Donald Trump's portrait behind them. They could tell, you could tell that that is what is trying. That's what makes this politically possible now, is the external threat posed by Donald Trump, the removal of access to the U.S. market, the economic threat that that forces. And so you can see the Prime Minister doing the calculation that they, as a federal government, have to give priority to a pipeline to the Pacific. And then the other part of the win that the Prime Minister is straining to underline is that you will get substantial carbon capture. And I'm sure as we hear him talk more, you're going to hear the Prime Minister make the argument that to environmental groups and to others who are concerned about climate, that this grand bargain where, you know, we're going to build a pipeline, but we're going to get carbon capture on the scale and at a speed that we hadn't anticipated, that makes this worth it, that makes this a win-win. And I think it's going to be really interesting, because if it's a grand bargain, it's also a grand risk politically. The raw politics of this are not easy to predict. It's not clear that this thing's a big winner for the Prime Minister when we come to Indigenous communities, specific communities. Obviously, the Premier of BC is giving this project a huge thumbs down. So there's going to be significant opposition and criticism of this. And again, I think that absent Donald Trump, the Prime Minister and the federal government wouldn't be able to pursue this politically.
I think the other sort of political factor or place where it's perhaps, you know, not resolutely palatable, Corey, as we take a look live inside the room where the Premier and the Prime Minister will sign this agreement, is around the cabinet table. There's a ton of speculation in Ottawa right now, for example, that former Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault won't find it palatable to remain in cabinet because of the details of this agreement. In your view, how much political capital do you see the Prime Minister expending on this, given what we just heard him detail?
Well, at a personal level and a political level, Ashley, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that I would be absolutely delighted if Stephen Guilbeault left the cabinet table as a result of this, because I think he's been absolutely detrimental to the economy and Canada's ability to actually move forward on resource projects and other things that I think are essential to us maintaining the sort of standard of living that we've become accustomed to pay for healthcare, to pay for all of the things that that Canadians hold dear, requires your economy to be doing well. And I think under the Trudeau years, the economy has not done well. They've lost sight of that of that issue and of that mandate that they should be trying to fulfill. I think Carney, wakes up in the morning and thinks more about the economy between 6 a.m. and 6:05 a.m. than Justin Trudeau did in any 6 months. And I think guys like Guilbeault are part of that Trudeau era ethos, and I frankly would like to see them gone.
I heard the Prime Minister make a couple efforts in those remarks, Nathan, to reference economic, and Scott mentioned this, but like economic benefits for all, to talk about First Nations and BC. A huge part of the story in the lead up to this MOU has been the reaction from BC's Premier and also coastal First Nations, which were integral parts of why Northern Gateway, for example, didn't go ahead. How do you think what you heard today ends up playing with BC's government? Like, does this make it better or worse than they thought it would be?
Well, we'll find out very soon. I can see out my window the BC legislature. I'm here visiting in Victoria and talking to former colleagues and people around that table. I don't know if saying the words cooperation, saying the words trust actually mean much when the Prime Minister has not been acting that way. We saw from the coastal First Nations, they've been very declarative about this. They haven't been spoken to. Like, they've reached out for months and months to the Prime Minister to say, hey, talk to us. We're right here. We're keen. We'll even come to Ottawa, whatever you need. And they've mostly been ignored. And you can hear the frustration in Premier Eby's voice. You keep talking about British Columbia. You keep talking about the coast, but you don't talk to us. And I'm just trying to imagine anybody trying to pull this kind of a project off against the wishes of Ontario or Alberta or Quebec and saying, we've signed an agreement with Saskatchewan that's going to have all the risk take place in Ontario or Quebec or Alberta, and we'll talk to you after the fact. And that's how we build trust. So the only caution I'd give to my enthusiastic pipeline friends is there is no pipeline here. There's no proponent. There's a lot of politics. And that for the tens of billions of dollars that are taking place right now, real projects, real proponents, private money in northwestern BC, those proceed at the pace of trust, particularly the trust with First Nations whose territory they happen in. And I would say that through all of what's happening today, there could be real damage, further damage to that feeling of trust with the federal government. And that's who is going to have to do this negotiation. This is not going to be Madam Smith's negotiation with the First Nations in northern BC. I can assure you of that.
We're standing by right now to watch the Prime Minister and the Premier of Alberta sign this Memorandum of Understanding on Energy and Climate. As soon as they do so, we'll be able to report to you all the details of what's contained in that MOU. Scott, I wanted to get your vantage point on that because I think, the opposition that the Premier and the Coastal First Nations have detailed to the prospect of this additional pipeline, it is not hard to predict. Like I think we would have anticipated, it would have been very normal to anticipate that opposition would exist, which is why it kind of perplexes me that this process unfolded the way it did. What do you attribute to that, and how much of a challenge do you think this is going to be for the Prime Minister?
Well, first, I would just offer one caution, which is we should be careful just because there's clear opposition. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of BC is opposed to us. We don't know where the majority opinion will come down on that. So I would just be careful about that. But you're right, and Nathan's right. The political opposition, the political criticisms of this were apparent, they're predictable, and they're very real. And they could cause real challenges for the Prime Minister, for the federal government. Could really create challenges for the federal Liberals in British Columbia. And I don't think they sat around a table saying, you know what the hell, we're going to roll the dice. We think we're going to win more seats in Alberta next time than we're going to win in BC. They know that's not true. So I'm forced to come to this conclusion, which I know is astonishing for a group of political hacks, but it seems to me that raw politics cannot be driving this decision. I think the Prime Minister had an economic ambition. I think he thinks he campaigned on, we're going to build stuff that couldn't get built before. And I think he knows that comes with some tension and some tough times and some tough opposition. And he's decided to move forward on that. The politics may not play out perfectly, but that clearly is where he's landed. And there was a chicken and egg issue. It's true there's no proponent. I think the Prime Minister recognized and ultimately agreed with those who argued there cannot be a proponent. There will be no private sector case for building a pipeline to the Asian markets as long as these regulatory barriers exist. So he's not guaranteeing any of this will occur, but he's saying, all right, ball's in your court. I'm going to take those steps. I'm going to take on the criticism. I'm going to wear whatever political bruises there are. Your job now is to come forward with a private sector proponent, work with BC coastal nations, First Nations, work with BC coastal chiefs and communities, province of British Columbia, and try to secure not just the economics, the financing, but also some of the social license that's required to move this project forward. He may suffer a lot of political criticism and not gain a lot of benefit here, but that's the calculation he's made, and it can't be one that's driven by raw electoral politics, because that's not where you would end up if you were thinking that way.
I see both Corey and Nathan want to jump in. Corey, I'll swing over to you. I think also it's like it can't be sort of overstated that, like, he is explicitly, like, to be clear, if you're removing the emissions cap, if you're providing an exemption of the tanker ban, if you're changing clean electricity regulations, like, you're explicitly agreeing with Danielle Smith in what she has said. What the Premier of Alberta has said is what is impinging the possibility of a private proponent. That is a very different position than the one the previous Prime Minister took. Like, it is a huge departure.
Radically.
Yeah, it's a completely different government, right? Like, I think, and it's only in office, I think, as a result of that. Like, the politics of Trudeau were pretty well understood by the end of his administration. Like, there might not have been a Liberal Party in Parliament had he continued on as leader. And what you're seeing with Carney is an incredibly different government compared to where Trudeau was. And this is, I think more clear every day. But I think, when we're talking about the politics, that is the mandate that he was given by the electorate, was to be something very different than Trudeau. He promised to be something very different than Trudeau. He's turned out to be very different than Trudeau. And I don't know. I don't think it's as big a political risk as maybe Scott does. Certainly there is a risk. Certainly this is being driven by things that are more than politics in terms of the decision to be this declarative. And I guess we'll see what happens. But I very much agree with Smith's assertion that there'll be no proponents if you say you can't fill a tanker and that you can't produce more oil on the oil sands. We're going to have caps on all of these things. No one in their right mind would actually come forward with a proposal with all of those things in the way. So now that they've been lifted, we'll see what proponents do come forward. And maybe there'll be some, maybe they won't. But I'll also point out that there's provinces to the east of Alberta that have lots of interest in pipelines. Whether it's Premier Canoe in Manitoba wanting to send a pipeline to the Port of Churchill, whether it's Premier Ford in Ontario wanting to do a version of Line 5 pipeline to Sarnia. There are a number of other proponents out there, other provinces out there that are more than happy to have a pipeline go through their jurisdiction.
But yeah, I would just quickly say, and Nathan, I'll give you the last word on this, like the Prime Minister was clear he wasn't talking about that pipeline. Like, that is what's so interesting, because provinces, maybe as you go east, are not voicing opposition, but the Premier of BC is. And the pipeline he said should be a priority is one that goes to the West Coast.
That's right. So much to say on such a big day. The one thing, to Scott's point, the politics is what it is. I'm actually not speaking to that. I'm speaking to the economics, because where I live and the companies that I work with know that the ability to have partnerships, agreement, impact benefit agreements, procedural agreements with First Nations is not a nice to have, it's a must have. You're not building a mine. You're not putting an electricity wire down. You're not building any kind of pipeline, gas or oil or anything, unless you have a collaboration and trust and agreements with First Nations. So my point is actually an economic one, that for a government to not speak to the rights and title holders of an area at all, as it then says we desperately want this project to go ahead to create the conditions where private money will show up, while not talking to First Nations and in fact insulting them as you go along, is economically not very smart for somebody who's an economist, who should understand constitutional law and obligations and all the rest. So to my point, because I lived the Enbridge experience, the social license people talk about, it was a disaster. They talked about buying trucks for Chiefs was their first pitch. It was awful and insulting, and it broke the relationship almost out of the gate. And in northern BC and northwestern BC, rivers, salmon, and the environment are really important. And we have to understand that diluted bitumen in a pipeline, if it spills, you cannot clean it up. You cannot. So let's understand where the risk is being absorbed in this suggestion. And it's being absorbed by the people who live in the Northwest. And the rights and title holders there have been really clear. So it's a little confounding still that I think we're not being spoken to. It's an afterthought, an after effect. And I don't think the Prime Minister can actually wash his hands after he signs this piece of paper today and say, over to you, Danielle Smith, or over to you, private sector company, figure out BC and figure out coastal First Nations. That's actually not where it works. That's not what the law says. This has already been tested in court. You need to speak from principle to principle, First Nations to the federal government. Mr. Carney will be implicated. He will have some incredibly important role if he expects to get the agreement of First Nations, which I think at this point is really a long shot, according to them, in their public statements.
Well, that signing is moments away. I anticipate Corey Scott and Nathan are kind enough to lend us their time as we wait for that. We're also scheduled to hear from, and that's the room where that's going to take place in Calgary. We're also scheduled to hear from both the Prime Minister, who will take questions from from reporters, pardon me, and Alberta's Premier, who will do the same. We're going to carry all of that live for you as it happens. Right now, though, I want to bring in Shachi Kurl. She's the president of the Angus Reid Institute as we await that signing, because she has done some extensive polling on the issue of pipelines, removing the tanker ban, both nationwide, but also specific to certain provinces. Hey, Shachi, great to see you as always.
Hey, good morning,
give us the big picture. The big picture, the lay of the land, not just in BC, but more broadly. I think the point has been made often that there is more license to do something like this because Canadians at this juncture, given what's going on with the U.S., could be more accepting of an additional pipeline. What's your read on that? What are your numbers?
Yeah, and that's absolutely the case. There is a moment that we're seeing nationally and even potentially a moment that we are seeing in British Columbia where Canadians are saying, yes, let's get on with it. And a lot of those questions, hesitations, concerns, opposition from a decade ago, where Canadians were very much following the leads, not just of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the time, but also, of Elizabeth May and of NDP leaders saying, no, these are not the right projects. Let's do clean energy. All of that has been, tossed up in the air and rearranged. And when you look at, the number of things that Canadians are concerned about and in what order, right now, issues around economic security and sovereignty are much more important to them. Fortunately or unfortunately, it is what it is than environment and climate change issues. We've seen that issue really take a dive in terms of primacy. But let's just go back to, so that's the broad picture. In British Columbia, it's a really interesting situation because it's almost like that Instagram meme, like the yes, but. So the yes is the fact that as of our last set of numbers, and stay tuned, I think we're talking again later today because we're going to have brand new numbers. But the last time we looked, a slim majority of British Columbians were saying, yeah, the idea of a pipeline from northern Alberta to northern British Columbia was acceptable to them. And then you had a whole bunch of people, about 40% saying no. And then you had, a significant number in that don't know column. Where the but part comes is in the concern that British Columbians have on lifting the tanker ban, whether as a one-off exemption for a project such as this or more broadly. You don't have, at this stage, majority buy-in from British Columbians around that. And I think that does speak to the sticking point. And, you know, News Santa thinks you've been a very good girl, Vashi, because this is going to be the issue that is going to consume all of us, I think, over the next 6 months as we start to hear from the Prime Minister. What kind of sales job is he going to be able to do to British Columbians? How meaningfully is he going to be able to engage with and meaningfully consult First Nations, those Indigenous communities along the northwest coast of British Columbia? Where are they on this issue? Because frankly, they're doing a lot in the LNG space. There are many, many money-making projects happening up there. Do communities in those situations, and we've heard what Nathan has said just a moment ago, but in those communities, is there an inclination to say, under certain conditions, we're maybe prepared, it's got to be a lot of ownership for us, or is it, hey, this is a project we don't need? And then who are the key spokespeople in this to actually bring it about or sink it? And certainly sending Danielle Smith to British Columbia to be the proponent or the person to bang the drum for this, probably not the best person.
Yeah, I'll be looking very closely at the language in the MOU around you know, whether this is private sector or what type of federal or provincial backstops would be involved, because I think that has led to certainly a lot of reaction, the prospect of it. I just want to take our viewers live now into the room where we expect the MOU to be signed by the Premier and the Prime Minister. Some of their staff and ministers are walking in. There's Brian Jean, for example, and I see the Federal Energy Minister and Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson, the Premier's Chief of Staff, Rob Anderson, a former provincial politician in Alberta. So we do anticipate any moment now the two of them will make their way in. Shachi, if I could just follow up on the tanker ban, because I mean, to put it plainly, if there is to be a pipeline out there, that you cannot, you know, put oil to a port without tankers coming to get it. So there would, I don't know if we're calling it exemption, removal, whatever it ends up being, like that would be a prerequisite of a pipeline actually getting built. When you say it's not as the delineation of support is not the same as it is otherwise, what can you detail that a bit?
Yeah, what we can see is that, you know, only about 44% of British Columbians say that they are on side in any way with lifting the tanker, call it the moratorium or the ban. Only about 1 in 5 British Columbians is of a view that that's something that is worthwhile doing and worth the risk. But again, Vashi, we're sort of into a reset around these conversations.
I'm so sorry, Shachi. I will interrupt you for a moment just because they're taking their seats. My apologies. We'll listen in live as the Premier and the Prime Minister sign the Memorandum of Understanding.
Okay. Doug is signing and look up.
Okay, do you want to sign and look up? Yeah. They won't be able to tell if it's just a photo, but it's
All right.
Lost art.
Thanks. Is that how he does it?
Yeah, just I think you got a little thumbs up.
He reads his signatures too. Yeah. Do you want to stand and do it? Do you want as well?
A round of applause inside the room there. Various ministers from both the federal and provincial governments present as the Premier and the Prime Minister shake hands after signing a memorandum of understanding on energy. My colleague, our senior political correspondent, Mike LeCouture, is here with me on set because we are now free to report the details of this memorandum of understanding. Mike, what's the headline?
Yeah, I think the fact that this is laying out all of the groundwork, not only for a pipeline, but at the top of page 2 of this memorandum of understanding, construction of 1 or more private sector constructed and financed pipelines. That is something that I think stands out on this, that it is not just a one pipeline, but really clearing the way for the possibility of others, Vashi, which I think is interesting. And yes, to make sure that this is going to be an application that has to be submitted to the Major Projects Office by July 1st, 2026. This is in addition to the expansion of Trans Mountain, which you'll see, as we've heard before, between 300 and 400,000 barrels of oil going to Asian markets. The agreement is also directly linked to Pathways 2 project.
Yeah.
One cannot happen without the other.
Yeah.
The fact that you can't get Pathways and you can't have the Pathways project without the pipeline, and the pipeline doesn't get done without Pathways either. That, I think, is another interesting thing. They're also suspending immediately, as we had heard, the clean electricity regulations in Alberta pending a new carbon agreement, carbon pricing agreement. And there's also this commitment to dialogue and collaboration and engagement with BC. So, not to say that there's an admission that BC has been excluded to this point, but certainly it is in the MOU that they will be included. The other thing, in addressing what Nathan has been talking about, whether or not there will be this consultation with Indigenous communities. There has been, in the background briefing that reporters got, they said that they're mindful that we have to work collaboratively with both Indigenous people across Alberta and BC, as well as the BC government. So understanding that that has maybe not happened up until this point, but back to the tanker ban, which I think is the interesting thing here, that a lot of people will say that is the thing that I know that Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, has said is key. That is the last step in all of this. In the Memorandum of Understanding, it's very clear that everything else has to happen, and then the tanker ban is considered, and a strategic deep water port, and that is where that pipeline would go. So it's interesting in how it leads everybody to that point, and only then will that tanker ban.
But it's explicit. It says, if an Alberta bitumen pipeline is ultimately approved under the Building Canada Act and provides opportunities for Indigenous co-ownership and shared economic benefits, Canada confirms that it will enable the export of bitumen from, as you've said, a strategic deepwater port to Asian markets, including, if necessary, through an appropriate adjustment to the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. That is a clear commitment from the federal government
100%.
to get rid of the tanker act as it applies, or tanker ban as it applies right now.
Exactly.
Should a pipeline be approved? I get your point about how it's like step by step, but that's black and white. Like that is
it is black and white that it will happen. If they meet all the other markers, and I'm not saying that it won't. I take your point as well, but I think the point that we were getting from the background briefing was that is kind of the last step here. That everything else has to be met, including private ownership of this. And I think the other interesting thing in terms of the dates is that Pathways, the Memorandum of Understanding for Pathways has to be done by April 1st, 2026. The window for building Pathways is in the year 2027 to 2040. And so one of the questions was, okay, when are shovels going to be in the ground for an actual pipeline? When can we expect that? And they said that there's no specific date, but 2029, if everything goes to plan, is the year that we could see shovels in the ground for a pipeline.
That's fast. Even for them to say that, that's fast. Okay, okay, Mike, thanks for all the details. Appreciate it. Our senior political correspondent, Mike Locouture, if you're just joining us now, we've got special coverage this morning into this, I guess it's this afternoon now, of a memorandum of understanding on energy and climate that the Prime Minister and the Premier of Alberta have just signed. We anticipate that we will hear from both of them individually as they take questions from reporters. We're lucky to be here with Scott Reed, Corey Tonight, and Nathan Cullen, who are listening to these details as they become available. I'll start the circle once again, Scott, with you. It is explicit on tanker ban, on a new pipeline. It does reference private ownership, but also talks about backstops from the federal and provincial governments for Indigenous co-ownership. What is your initial read on what this does and what it doesn't?
I think it's interesting to see what comes first and what comes later. And, you know, the tanker ban is a conditional move. If I read this, and you're right, it's emphatic, it's in black and white, that will happen, but it will happen provided the other things have started to move and lock into place. I mean, I think there is an argument that could be made. It won't be made explicitly because it would undermine the cooperative nature of the MOU. But I think there's an argument that could be made at the federal level, which is, look, we're getting pathway, we're getting carbon capture. That feels real. That's moving forward. And now we are creating the conditions for this other thing to occur. So the pipeline might happen if the financing can be put in place, and if some some agreement and collaboration and equity participation with Indigenous groups, if that can occur. But it feels to me like the government's going to be able, the federal government's going to be able to make the case. We get something relatively upfront. We're going to be able to make a claim that we've actually made a substantial move toward lower emissions, carbon capture, and we're trading off that against the possibility of this. Now, it is clear, though, they are saying we are 100% behind this. We're actually going to use the Building Canada Strong Act. We are going to move on the tanker ban. We will do these things. So there's no question, in for a penny, in for the pound. The federal government is committed to this pipeline, and it's got hard dates and hard facts behind it. It's a pretty detailed document at a glance.
Yeah, it's like I think it's 6 or so pages, or 5 pages, pardon me, in very small writing. And I will just point out that the other thing that stuck out to me, like, for example, on pathways, right, which has been a key part of their pitch, that there's going to be this decarbonized oil, or whatever you want to call it. Like, Mike had mentioned, it stipulates that both are a prerequisite of the other. So there is no pathways without a new bitumen pipeline. Like, that is
Yeah, but I think it's sensible. I think it's a sensible approach. Like, I think there is something here for everyone, frankly, and there's risk here for everyone, political and otherwise. There has been a desire to have carbon capture and storage and to reduce the carbon footprint of Canadian oil production. That's something, if you're looking for things that I think Stephen Guilbeault would agree with, that would be probably at the top of the list. But to make those investments, there's got to be a future and an expanded future for energy production in Western Canada, and so tying the two together, I think, is a pretty logical thing to do. It really is a grand bargain. I'm surprised at the level of detail. I'm surprised at the firmness of the commitments in the thing. I think it's unlike anything that we've seen before, not just with this government, but I think with any federal provincial arrangement where you'd have an MOU of this level of detail, of this level of ambition, to be signed. And I guess we'll see how it goes, but I admire the ambition of the thing, and I guess we'll see how it goes with BC. I think there's a lot of political risk in this for EB as well. To Sashi's earlier point, the popularity around pipelines has shifted dramatically. And not just in Alberta but in Quebec and BC, all across the country. So I think there's a huge opportunity here for First Nations. I think there's an opportunity for BC. There's an opportunity for Canada. So let's see where it goes. But very ambitious.
I also, Nathan, just given how many different MOUs or agreements I've reported on, did not anticipate this level of detail. And I actually thought the lack of detail would provide some cover politically for the backlash, right? You could open the conversation up and say, hey, there's lots to be finalized, Premier Eby, let's have a discussion now. I wonder, though, what kind of reaction you think the level of detail, the specificity, the firmness with which the commitments are made, what kind of reaction you think that will generate among your colleagues in the provincial NDP, your former colleagues?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've looked at it for 2 minutes. Going to spend a little bit more time because it is very small print. It did require my glasses.
Yes, tiny.
Tiny, ridiculous, unacceptable. It's an interesting approach because it does give specificity. I think it raises expectations, especially amongst those who want the tanker ban lifted. They want tankers on the North Coast, and they want the pipeline. It has now raised an expectation of that being a likely scenario if you read that MOU and all things come to pass. I will have some questions about the timing on this carbon capture. Does it really sequentially go that it is funded and built before you're able to build a bitumen pipeline to the North Coast, or what happens first? We've seen grand bargains before. There was a grand bargain with Alberta under Trudeau that was, we'll put a price on carbon and we'll eventually have the entire Canadian public pay for a new $35 billion pipeline for you. Well, we have the $35 billion pipeline, but we don't have a carbon price anymore. So you can understand that some people get a little shy about these grand bargains because some part of it happens and not all of it together. All that to be said, the specificity is fine. But I'm not sure that anybody, and particularly I'm thinking of coastal First Nations, what they've said publicly, We had that joint letter from the Haisla and the community of Kitimat, who are as pro-industry as you're probably going to get anywhere in the country, who have said no thanks to oil. Like, we're doing a lot. And for your viewers, Vashi, and for everybody listening, for those living in the Northwest, there's a real feeling like we're doing a lot. The concentration of private investment and industrial activity and resource extraction and tankers, LNG tankers in that case, that are going to be plying our waters and impacting our land. And people are saying you're not Canadian because you oppose this project is kind of offensive to a part of the world that is doing more than any other part of the country is right now to contribute to the country, knowing that it does have impact on where we live. So I just want to sort of level set it a little bit with people who are like, you're saying no to this. And I would say that's true also for the EV government. They've said yes a lot. They've said yes to the two biggest investments in Canadian history in the private sector. And some people are like, you just want to say no. And it's like, well, is that fair or true? And it's neither fair nor true. So this is a reasonable government in British Columbia. They are taking a strong position on this, and it's a known position. And I think our process to this point has not helped win over hearts and minds of people, particularly coastal First Nations and people opposed to oil tankers on our north coast, because you waited till after you inked an agreement today in Calgary at an event sponsored by oil companies to tell us what's going to happen on our west coast. And you didn't have the dignity or grace to come and talk to us first. And that's just about respect. And I think every province, every group of Canadians, we like respect. It's a nice thing to have. And it's actually critical, not talking politics, I'm talking business. It's critical to getting things done.
Well, we are going to hear, I just was told in my ear, from Premier Eby, 3:45 Eastern, 12:45 Pacific. He'll hold a press conference any minute now. We're going to hear from Premier Smith, and then following that, the Prime Minister. I'm going to take a quick commercial break. Nathan, Scott, and Corey are sticking around for their analysis. We'll be back with more special coverage of this Memorandum of Understanding now just signed by the Prime Minister and Premier Smith. Back in a moment with more here on Power Play.
The Rookie, new season Tuesday, January 6th on CTV.
Take comments momentarily from the Premier of Alberta. Right now, though, I want to bring in just down the hall from where that's taking place, Gary Marr. He's a former Alberta MLA and Cabinet Minister and the President and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. Gary, it's a pleasure to see you as always. What is the buzz there? How big of a deal now that we've seen the details of this pretty lengthy and specific MOU? Like, what is the buzz there about how big of a deal this is?
There's a lot of enthusiasm in the room. The Prime Minister and the Premier, after they signed the MOU, went into a room where a number of people were there, including First Nations, oil and gas executives, people from unions, from agencies. There was a lot of enthusiasm. The Prime Minister got a rousing thank you from the crowd that was there. And it's a big day, and this is a long time coming. They've been working on this for a long time, and making sure that we can get oil to Tidewater, to Asian markets. The objective of the exercise is to double our exports to markets other than the United States, and getting a pipeline to the West Coast is important, and it will generate tremendous economic opportunities for many people involved.
You've been in politics a long time. You and I have spoken on many occasions where the federal government was at odds with the Premier of Alberta, both this iteration in Danielle Smith and the previous in Jason Kenney around oh, my apologies. I have to interrupt myself, Gary. I'm so sorry. The Premier's just stepped up to the podium. We'll take a listen in live.
Well, hello, my friends. Good morning, everyone. I hope you enjoyed hearing the comments of the Prime Minister this morning. I was pleased he was able to pop up and see you before going on to some of his other meetings today, as well as a speech at the Chamber. I'm so delighted to be here with not only members of my cabinet, but also our partners in Indigenous communities. We've got Rebecca Schultz, Minister of Environment and Protected Areas, Rajan Sani, Minister of Indigenous Relations, Jason Nixon, Minister of Assisted Living and Social Services. He was part of our negotiating team. Nathan Neudorf, Minister of Affordability and Utilities. Minister Brian Jean, Minister of Energy and Minerals. And then, of course, we have Billy Morin, former chief, but he's now MP for Edmonton Northwest. Former Chief Jim Boucher of the Mackay First Nation. Chris Sankey, former councillor of Laxqualam Band in British Columbia, Dave Lamouche, President of Métis Settlements General Council, Chief George Arcan Jr. of Alexander First Nation, Chief Tony Alexis of Alexander Nakota Sioux Nation, Chief Cody Thomas of Enoch Cree Nation, Chief Kelsey Jacko of Cold Lake First Nations. We also have a friend visiting from Saskatchewan, Chief Delbert Wapas of Thunderchild First Nation, and of course Stephen Buffalo, President and CEO of the Indian Resource Council. We had a few others on the list. I'm not sure that they are here, but I'm going to see more at the Indian Resource Council meeting a little bit later today, where I'm going to go for a lunch speech. But today is a great day for the people of Alberta and for all of Canada. The last 10 years have been an extremely difficult time for hundreds of thousands of Albertans and their families that directly or indirectly rely on and make their living from a strong and vibrant and growing Alberta oil and gas sector. These Albertans are mothers and fathers and young people working so hard to put food on the table, to pay for hockey and soccer fees, and to save for the down payment on their first home. These are also small business owners that too often have found themselves as well in their business working very hard to build due to a regulatory environment that has made it almost impossible for them to succeed. And more broadly, the last 10 years have left hundreds of thousands of Albertans skeptical and oftentimes questioning the long-term viability of our nation as we watched its deliberate phase-out of our province's most valuable asset, leaving it trapped and wasted in the vast oil sands of northern Alberta, and with it, innumerable lost investment opportunities and tens of thousands of lost jobs. These were dark times, but in those difficult circumstances, Albertans came together, as we always do, to raise our voices and use our ingenuity to find a way to overcome the challenge. We fought and won in the courts of law. We fought and won in the court of public opinion. And we fought because we had to, because that's what Albertans do. We always fight very hard for this province that we love so dearly and for its incredible people. But Albertans are also proud and loyal Canadians. We don't fight for the sake of fighting. We don't look for conflict when there is an opportunity for peace and prosperity. Albertans are happiest when we are hard at work getting things done, solving problems, creating opportunities, building our province and our country. That is when we are truly at our best. However, in order for Alberta to find its way to prosperity within a united Canada, we need the federal government to partner with us instead of fighting against us. Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney and I may not always agree on everything, but we do share a few key beliefs. We both know that Canada can never reach its true potential as a global energy superpower without a strong and thriving Alberta energy sector at the center of that effort. And I am pleased to say that this Prime Minister has made it clear to me that he is willing to work with me and Alberta's government to accomplish that shared goal. And that, my friends, is something that we have not seen from a Canadian Prime Minister in over a decade. And it is my firm belief that Albertans from right across the political spectrum, whether they be staunch federal Conservatives or Liberals or New Democrats or something else, they expect me as their Premier to partner with this federal government to seize this long-awaited opportunity for our province. I've spoken at length about the need to build more pipeline infrastructure, to export more oil to hungry Asian markets, and to diversify our customer base. I have repeatedly stated how critical it is to reform a broken regulatory environment that is scaring away investment and demoralizing our energy entrepreneurs here at home. And I have asked repeatedly for the federal government to cease their attempts to throttle our energy industry, repeal or overhaul their 9 bad laws, and work with Alberta to grow our energy sector for the benefit of the entire country. And today's agreement is the first step in accomplishing all of these critical objectives and unleashing the power and promise of Alberta's energy sector in a way never seen before in this country. This agreement means the end of the punitive oil and gas emissions caps so that our great energy producers can grow and thrive again. This agreement means the immediate suspension of the federal net zero power regulations in Alberta, which had placed our electrical grid at a very serious risk of failure and limited any hope of substantial investment in AI data centers and applications development. This agreement includes a clear path to the construction of an over 1 million barrel per day Indigenous co-owned bitumen pipeline to Asian markets so that our province and our country are no longer dependent on just one customer to buy our most valuable resource. This agreement also allows for needed adjustments to the tanker ban when the new pipeline to Asia is approved by the Major Projects Office, as well as amendments that will ensure our companies are able to advertise their environmental leadership and efforts throughout the world without a fear of penalty. And this agreement also means that Alberta will be a world leader in the development and implementation of emissions reduction infrastructure, particularly in carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Alberta has a unique opportunity to show the entire world that the solution for reducing emissions does not entail capping productivity, growth, or innovation in oil and gas development. Rather, it is to leverage the profitability of the oil and gas sector to invest in the very technologies that will revolutionize all industries in their effort to reduce emissions globally. This agreement means Alberta will work with our federal partners and the Pathways companies to commence and complete the world's largest carbon capture, utilization, and storage infrastructure project. It will also make Alberta heavy oil the lowest intensity barrel on the market and displace millions of barrels of heavier emitting fuels around the globe. This is Alberta's moment of opportunity. Our opportunity to show the nation, as well as the entire world, that resource development and emissions reduction can not only coexist, but can actually complement one another for the benefit of billions of people around the world. Alberta is willing to take on and conquer the challenge as partners with the federal government. Now, I need to be clear, the government is just this agreement with the government is just the first step in this journey. there is much more hard work to be done. Trust must be built and earned in the partnership as we move through the next steps of this process, whether that be working with the federal government to prepare our bitumen pipeline submission for the Major Projects Office, or putting together the final elements of a carbon pricing agreement that will be implemented through the province's tier program that balances competitiveness with accountability for heavy emitters. And although I am not blind to the fact that the people of Alberta have had the rug pulled out from underneath them too many times to count over the past 10 years, I also know that a new relationship and a new beginning needs a starting point grounded in good faith. And today, I hope, is that new starting point. So I do want to thank the Prime Minister. So I do want to thank the Prime Minister as well as his team for working with my team to get this agreement to the finish line. I'd also like to thank our negotiating team, and that included Ministers Jason Nixon and Rajan Sawhney, along with my Chief of Staff, Rob Anderson, and Deputy Ministers Liam Stone and Larry Comeyer for the great work that they did on this initiative. And I'm excited, as is my government and our UCP MLAs, to roll up our sleeves and to continue the work on this remarkable opportunity for Alberta and for Canada. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you. Thanks so much. Now, I think Sam Blackett is somewhere moderating questions. Oh, there he is.
Yes, we'll now start the media Q&A. We are tight in time today. We'll be taking one question, one follow-up per usual. Please state your name and outlet before asking your question, and we'll start off at our mic in the room. Go ahead.
All right, Heather Yurix-West from Global National. Thanks for taking my question.
Yeah.
What is your view, Premier, of the power of BC or a First Nation to veto a potential pipeline deal? The MOU talks a lot about consultation, but what happens if an agreement can't be reached?
Well, as you can see, the MOU does not contain a veto. But I think that we both recognize jointly that there is a requirement for consultation. And indeed, we believe that there's an imperative for Indigenous ownership. We created the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, and it expanded its ability to underwrite up to $3 billion worth of loan guarantees. I see British Columbia also has a similar program. The federal government has a similar program. And so Minister Sawhney has already begun the engagement. She's been to Kitimat, she's been to Prince Rupert, she's been talking with the BC and Alberta nations, and we know that that's hard work that needs to be done, that we will do, we intend to do, and we're looking forward to having genuine consultation and ownership. And as for Premier Eby, I spoke with him last night, and there's lots in the agreement that we can focus on together, where he is supportive of the expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline capacity. He is supportive of Intraties and working with us on nuclear. He's supportive of working with us on expanding additional LNG export as well as ammonia. So may not be in agreement with everything that is in this proposal, but we're going to have trilateral talks to make sure that we can move forward on the elements in this plan.
And my follow-up, do you think this MOU will be enough to distinguish, quell any remaining separatist sentiment that may remain in Alberta?
I hope so. I mean, I had always felt that the former government of Justin Trudeau created the independence movement, and my first conversations with Prime Minister, with Mark Carney, were that he could end it. He could take the wind out of it. Because we saw this once before. We saw that independence sentiment was very high in the early 1980s when there was the National Energy Program. But when Brian Mulroney came in and reversed that policy, it disappeared. So I would say that good policy and genuinely addressing the concerns of Albertans is always a pathway to have a good and solid relationship. And I think the Prime Minister understands that. Certainly, based on this agreement, it shows he does, and so I'm hopeful.
Thanks.
Thanks. Hi, Premier Ezra Levant from Rebel News. The first deadline in the MOU, if I'm reading it right, is April, where the duty is on Alberta to jack up carbon taxes. And the last date in the MOU, if I'm reading it right, correct me if I'm not, is 2040. That's when this pipeline, that's sort of the end date. It can't be any later than that. In terms of building trust with the anti-oil liberals, They're asking Alberta to raise carbon taxes now for a promise of an oil pipeline years or even more than a decade in the future. Does that really build trust?
Well, you have to start somewhere. And one thing I would say is that we did have the Supreme Court of Canada rule on the federal government's ability to set a price on emissions. So the Supreme Court has ruled on that. It's part of the reason why we negotiated a stringency agreement that would have seen the carbon tax price go up to $170 a barrel by 2030. We've demonstrated, and I think the Prime Minister agrees, that's too high, too fast. So that's why we understand that there was always going to be a negotiation around that. We froze the carbon tax at $95, pending consultation with the industry and greater work with the Prime Minister. But remember, Alberta was the first to have an industrial carbon price. They did we implemented that in 2007. It's generated revenues that have allowed us to invest billions of dollars in new technologies, including carbon capture. So there is a commitment on the part of the industry to have a carbon price, and we did do some consultation on that. We're just glad that we have the means to manage it our way in Alberta under our tier program, and you'll see as of April 1st, and no, that wasn't a joke. April 1st is going to be the date that we have an agreement on that front. When it comes to the building of a bitumen pipeline to Asian markets to the BC coast. Though, if you read the MOU, those two things have to happen in tandem. That we have to see the Pathways project proceeding at the same time as an agreement to build that. One is dependent on the other. I don't know that the Prime Minister would have agreed to a new bitumen pipeline without Pathways, and we wouldn't have agreed to Pathways without a new bitumen pipeline. So they are going to be staged. They are going to go on together. We've already had a meeting with Pathways about how we're going to do that. That will require a trilateral negotiation as well. But I'm very hopeful. Since we have used carbon capture technology before for enhanced oil recovery, that's another part of this announcement, is that CO2 will be able to be used for enhanced oil recovery, which should allow us to generate more revenue. So I would say that you don't always get 100% of what you want, but we addressed 7 out of the 9 bad laws that I'd put on the table to, I think, what will be the satisfaction of Albertans. And I think that this will allow us to see some substantial investments.
I mean, that's the thing about a peace deal. You have to make it with an enemy. So I suppose the fact that for a decade, his Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, it was about putting a capital strike on the oil and gas sector. Just a couple of weeks ago, he was asked about pipelines, and he said, boring. So is there anything, I mean, after a lifetime of attacking the oil patch, he was even interrogated by the U.S. Congress for an attempt to capital strike their oil companies. Is there anything the Prime Minister has said to you in private that you could share with us that would signal that his lifetime's work of attacking carbon-based fuels will somehow be put to the side? Like, I think he's just a slightly smarter version of Stephen Guilbeault. I think he hates the oil patch as his life's work. Is there anything he's said to you that make you believe that maybe he can be turned on this?
Well, I'll start by saying my joke has been that I would love for pipelines to be boring again. I would love for, no matter what party is in power, what level of government, that there wasn't sort of an overwrought response anytime anyone talked about building a pipeline. It's actually quite remarkable that we're talking about expanding uranium mines, building nuclear power plants, building new transmission lines through pristine areas, massive new mining projects, and not one of them has raised any ire on the part of any environmental group or anyone in the media, but there has been all of this ire raised around a pipeline. So I hope that we can make pipelines boring again, because it's just a way to get our product to the consumers who need it. I would say that, as you know, I was not a huge champion of carbon capture technology when I was in politics the first time. I wasn't. But I've seen with the passage of time, the investments being made and the fact that the technology works and we're getting better and better at it, and you can create a product out of it, including so that you can enhance oil recovery, I changed my mind. And so I would say that the Prime Minister, maybe in the past 10 years, it looked like wind and solar and batteries were going to be the ability to power industrial economies. I think the world discovered that's not true with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the instability in the Middle East. Everyone is having to recalibrate and rethink that. I was recently in the Middle East, and the conversation around the table now is talking about natural gas as a foundational fuel, not a transition fuel. So I think that demonstrates that there is a global understanding of how important it is to have reliable electricity. And so I have to just give the Prime Minister credit for perhaps he's recalibrating his own thinking on this. It certainly seems to be in the agreement that we signed, but we will trust, but we will verify. We will make sure that he lives up to the commitments in this agreement that we had, and we have to proceed somewhere with a measure of good faith. I can tell you 100% that the former Prime Minister would never have moved this far on these issues. We tried for 3 years, we got nowhere. And in my very first meeting with the Prime Minister, I said to him, you know, the way that we can get to an agreement is just orienting around a 2050 target. Our industry is there. We think it's achievable with technology, and you'll see in the context of this MOU that the interim targets are gone. And so that's what we're going to move forward on, and we'll see as we meet these milestones whether I'm correct or whether your skepticism is correct.
Thanks, Ezra. We're going to take one more from the room, then take one or two from the phones before coming back to the room. Go ahead.
Hi, Premier. Laura Osmond with The Logic. When it comes to trying to find a proponent for this pipeline, is this MOU enough to start bringing private investment on board? Or in your conversations with potential proponents, are they looking to get farther down the line? At what point do you think you might be able to announce some kind of proponent taking over?
Well, I think that the fact that this room filled up with, I think, 24 hours notice gives you an idea of the enthusiasm that we have in the sectors that make billion-dollar investment decisions. And many of the people in this room have been holding on to capital or redeploying it elsewhere. So I think that's going to cause a lot of really interesting conversations now that they've seen the structure of this agreement. We'll know in the coming weeks and months, generally speaking, about final investment decisions. But I've been encouraged to see that even with the announcement in the budget that they were looking at not implementing the emissions cap, which we confirm today. You've seen Enbridge talk about 400,000 barrels a day on their main line that they want to expand. TMX has talked about an additional 400,000 barrels per day that they want to optimize. South Bow, using the old Keystone assets, have talked about a 650,000 barrel a day project. I've been in touch, the folks from the St. Lawrence Seaway Group have been in touch with me saying, can we get oil to Thunder Bay so that we can get it out on tankers to markets in Europe. We have oil by rail projects being talked about going all the way to Nova Scotia and being exported out of Sydney. I'm watching with great interest as Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew negotiates an economic corridor co-owned with First Nations, and whether there's an opportunity for us to also be able to have a pipeline go there and also reach European markets. Doug Ford and I signed an MOU about perhaps having a spur line going to James Bay with a similar kind of model. So all of those projects are now going to be able to go ahead because there is not going to be an emissions cap on our production. And in the meantime, because I think our biggest opportunity is a new market, a new pipeline to get to markets in Asia, I'll be spending a lot of time working on that. So we have, I think, 20 individuals at our table giving us advice from all of the big pipeline companies who have over 100 years, I think, of expertise, more than that, I think, combined in doing these kinds of big projects. And in the end, you'll see the MOU says that we want a private proponent to build that. I don't think it would be success if we have to have the federal government once again have to pay for an overpriced, expensive pipeline. I think we want to create the conditions so that the private sector has confidence and will build it. So that's what we're working towards. We knew we needed to get through these first few phases, but I'm pretty confident with the people we have at the table that one or a consortium of them, once we establish that it is on the major projects list, will be willing to take this on.
You have mentioned that it's a long road. You still have to build trust. You've had the rug pulled out from you before. Pipeline aside, is the changes to the emissions cap and the clean energy regulations enough, do you think, to increase oil production in Alberta and improve the investment environment here?
Well, I think almost certainly. The problem with the emissions cap is that, especially with the interim targets of 2030 and 2035, the only way to achieve that, because we wouldn't have been able to build the carbon capture utilization and storage or the fuel variety like nuclear, or have advanced direct air capture. The only way to achieve them would be to shut in production. And it wasn't just us saying that. There's several different reports that went out saying as much as 2 million barrels a day would have to be shut in by 2035. So we now have a longer time horizon to address the issues of emissions. We've a big change is that we're going to have a look at heavy oil on the basis of emissions intensity compared to other heavy barrels around the world. That is also, I think, going to be a major confidence booster. And then on the other side, when I was recently in the Middle East, I talked to a company, Taka, that had talked about wanting to do an AI data center. They were going to build their own natural gas power, but they told me because of the clean electricity regs, which meant they'd have to turn it off in 2035, they didn't even get started. And I have to wonder how many other projects of that nature didn't even get started because of the clean electricity regs. So now that there's an immediate suspension of that, there will, of course, be pending our agreement on what the tier pricing will be. But there has always been a carbon price on heavy emitters, and that included in the electricity sector. So I think we'll be able to give that injection of confidence. I guess we'll know in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. We're going to go to the phones for one and then come back to the room for our last one. Operator, could you put through our first caller, please?
Your first caller comes from the line of Brian Tumilty from Toronto Star. Your line is now open.
Yeah, good afternoon, Premier. Thanks for taking the question. You know, the MOU sets out obligations on both Alberta and the government. If the government of Canada lives up to its obligations, but a private proponent doesn't emerge for the bitumen pipeline, is Alberta still committed to increasing its carbon price and the other commitments that you've made on pathways and other projects?
Well, as I said, we have always had a carbon price. We were the first to put one in place in 2007. We have just recently made changes to tier to allow those revenues to be recycled back to companies so that they can invest in carbon capture technology. We have put in place our ACIP program, which is our carbon capture incentive program, where we rebate 12% of the cost of any investment in carbon capture. We've got a major center in central Alberta where 10 different direct air capture projects are underway. We have signed agreements not only with the federal government, but with our fellow premiers on looking at how we would add nuclear to the grid. So all of those things are underway. All of those things will continue to go. And what we're very hopeful is that as we stage gate the development of a bitumen pipeline, we'll also do the same thing with the Pathways project. And then we'll be able to have the largest carbon capture project in the world, which I think will also be another major export opportunity for us. So I would say that we showed our commitment when we released our energy development and emissions reduction plan in April of 2023, and most of the elements that we announced then, you'll see, are enshrined in this agreement that we have today.
And then the coastal First Nations, especially, but certainly BC as well, have said so far publicly, they said they really don't support this pipeline. It seems like the MOU puts bringing those people on side in your court. Can you expand upon how you intend to do that and how you intend to see that happens?
Well, I can tell you that there are some leadership in some nations that have been vocal, absolutely. But as you can see, there are some leaders of some nations that are in this room supportive as well. And that's the nuance that happens. That will be, no matter whether it's a nation or whether it's a province or whether it's a political party, there's just different opinions on things. But what this agreement shows is that we're going to work collaboratively to work towards a bitumen pipeline to Asian markets on the West Coast. And when we arrive at a port, that will also have a tanker ban carve-out for that. So I would say that my Indigenous Relations Minister is doing tremendous work on doing the initial engagement, which will ultimately lead to a more formal consultation process. We're beginning with a spirit of goodwill, having had some success with our AIOC. I think that demonstrates credibility in having a meaningful equity ownership stake. And we've had very constructive meetings. I had a very constructive meeting you may have read with the Haisla chief and council and others yesterday, where they may not be 100% behind a bitumen pipeline, but they're excited about LNG export. They wanted us to make sure that we knew that Kitimat is a thriving port for all kinds of commodities. And so I think that that's where the relationship begins. Let's talk about areas of agreement, and then let's work through the areas of disagreement. But I think that we will find over time that there are many nations who are also interested in these kinds of projects so they can bring prosperity to their people. And that's our starting point on this.
Thank you. And if you're really quick, Premier, we might be able to squeeze in 2 more. Okay. And we'll go to our next to the mic.
Sheila Gunn Reid with Rebel News. Just staying on the topic of British Columbia, the Prime Minister has said in the House of Commons just 2 days ago, we believe the government of British Columbia has to agree. Now, just now, after he left the signing with you, his press release says these projects will only be built in consultation and partnership with Indigenous rights holders and British Columbia. So what is the real strength of this MOU when you have a partner who keeps giving veto to British Columbia?
Well, you'll see in the agreement there's no mention of veto. I think that there obviously has to be trilateral discussions with British Columbia to find areas of common ground, and I think we will. And there's also clearly going to have to be a formal consultation process with Indigenous bands, and we're prepared to do all of that. What I have seen is that there have been a number of projects in British Columbia that may have started off with a lot of opposition that over time
we're going to swing away. We're going to swing away from this press conference with Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith because the Prime Minister has just stepped up to the microphone to take questions from reporters as well. He's also in Calgary. We'll take a listen in live there.
And a start of much more. On va commencer. Quelques questions.
Start with a few questions.
Quelques en français.
Take questions.
Yep.
First question.
Pas de questions? No questions? Okay. No, just kidding.
Yes, please. The mic is over there.
There's a mic over there.
First question. Première question.
Anis Hidari, CBC. Prime Minister, are you willing to approve a pipeline even if British Columbia or affected First Nations don't agree? Would you compensate them instead?
Well, just to be clear, this agreement today between Alberta and the Government of Canada, it's the first step. It's an example of cooperative federalism. We're agreeing in partnership and in a spirit of trust. But what has to happen, several things have to happen before a pipeline is built. And one of those is a private sector proponent. Secondly, goes directly to your question, which is that there needs to be full partnership, including equity ownership, substantial economic benefits with First Nations in Alberta, First Nations in British Columbia, as well as agreement and substantial economic benefits for the people of British Columbia. So we look at this as the start of a process. We've created some of the necessary conditions for this to happen. But there's a lot more work to do, and very much in the spirit of partnership. Et en français, c'est un grand moment pour l'Alberta.
This is a great moment for Alberta and Canada, but it's just the start of a process. A process that needs many things. We are starting with a private sector proponent for the pipeline. And second, and this is fundamental, we need partnerships with Indigenous peoples here in Alberta and in British Columbia. Partnerships with substantial benefits. And this includes shares in the projects and substantial benefits for British Columbia. As I mentioned, this is just the start of a process of engagement, of discussion, and of partnership.
What if there aren't any private sector proponents? You mentioned them there.
Well, if there's not a private sector proponent, there won't be a pipeline. I mean, and let me say another thing, if I could, just to take advantage of your question, which this agreement is about much more than just a pipeline. Pipeline's obviously an important component to this, and specifically as a priority of Pipeline to Asia. But it's also the Pathways Project, the world's largest carbon capture storage project, a project that will make Alberta energy, specifically oil and gas, competitive for the long term because it'll make it low carbon. A project that will create an entirely new industry, an industry that needs workers, like the workers here. It's also about nuclear, building nuclear capacity in Alberta, building interties, transmission interties. We need a lot of iron for transmission interties with British Columbia, with Saskatchewan, so we have a much more efficient and competitive and lower cost grid. And it's about building AI data centers that are sovereign, to use the word. So that means that we control in Canada our data, our information, our intelligence, if I could put it that way. So it's a very ambitious and comprehensive partnership, and there's many things that can be done going forward.
Aussi en français.
Also in French? So, if there is no private sector proponent for the pipeline, there will be no pipeline. That's clear. It's not a question of federal government money, nor Alberta government money. But this MOU is bigger than just a pipeline. It includes carbon storage, the Pathways project, and this is the largest carbon storage project in the world. And it will be a new industry for Alberta and for Canada. It includes nuclear energy. It includes connections between the electricity systems of BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and perhaps Yukon and Northwest Territories. It also includes data centers in artificial intelligence. There's a lot to do, and we will be needing a lot of specialized workers, just like those workers that are here.
I want to thank our viewers watching us on the main network in Quebec and Ontario. Our coverage continues right now on News Channel.
After signing the agreement, well, this MOU is the start of a process, as I said before. For example, when it comes to the environmental aspects, we will need to determine the process for the Pathways carbon storage project for clean energy. And at the core of this agreement is strengthening the tier systems. That's the industrial carbon pricing system. The province of Alberta is committed to removing the effective price in that tier system and setting it at $130. That is more than 6 times the price currently. So that's one example, but there are others. But it's a great example of how strengthening rules or systems can be effective when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it is a process that will be going on until the beginning of April. But is that enough? Because there's a threat that Stephen Guilbeault will leave cabinet if it's not enough? It's enough for the Canadian government. I'm the Prime Minister, and I need to make decisions in the interest of Alberta and of Canada. And in order to get results, real results in reduction of GHG emissions, this requires investments. Investments in Alberta, in BC, and large-scale investment across Canada. With this MOU, we are setting the conditions for major investments in carbon storage and connection with the electricity systems in nuclear energy. And all of that is necessary. It's necessary to bring investments in methane reductions here in Alberta, and all of that is required. We need that in order to bring down GHG emissions.
A warm welcome to all of our viewers watching us on our main network in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. You're looking live at the Prime Minister in Calgary, Alberta.
Finalized and made more specific over the course of the next several months by the start of April. But at its core is tightening the tier system, which is the industrial carbon price system here in Alberta, to a level of at least $130 with a pass price from there. What does that mean? It means more than a 6 times increase in the industrial price of carbon, from its effective level, which is much lower than the headline level, the effective level, to the level that's committed in the agreement. That's the first thing. The second is methane reductions in methane, more than 75% reductions in methane by 2035, that commitment that's there. Thirdly, it creates the conditions for this big investment in the Pathways project, the largest in the world, which will have huge reductions in emissions, the equivalent of taking more than 90% of the cars and trucks off the roads here in Alberta in the first phase of that project. It also creates the conditions for nuclear power and the conditions for interties between British Columbia, which is a clean grid, with Saskatchewan, with the Northwest Territories and Yukon, all to make it more efficient, more sustainable. You know, we are going to get to our greenhouse gas objectives, our climate objectives, by only through massive investment. And so we need agreements like this in order to drive that massive investment. That's why that's one of the reasons why this is a good day for Alberta, a good day for Canada, and that's what the Government of Canada is committed to doing. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Merci. Thank you.
All right, that is Prime Minister Mark Carney in Calgary, Alberta, just making some comments, responding to some questions from reporters following the signing of a very significant memorandum of understanding between himself and the Premier of Alberta. We've been talking all morning through our special coverage of what's in that memorandum of understanding and reaction to it. Right now, we have live with us from Calgary as well, I think just down the hall, the Premier of the province, Danielle Smith. Premier Smith, it's a pleasure to see you. As always, thank you so much for making the time.
Hi, Bashi.
I was listening to your press conference very closely just a few moments ago, and my impression was you were speaking as though it's kind of a done deal with this pipeline. And I just wanted to be clear for our viewers. If there is no private proponent, this pipeline doesn't get built, correct? Still?
That's what it says in the MOU. We're looking to have a private proponent build it. And that's, I think, the whole purpose of this exercise with the Major Projects Office, is that we want to ensure that we've got a regulatory process that is not only predictable, but will also result in a positive outcome. And once we get to that point, I have no doubt that a private proponent, either a single one or a consortium, will step forward to build it. And that's what we're working towards.
There is also language in the MOU, though, around a backstop, about the potential backstop, I should say, at both the federal and the provincial level when it comes to Indigenous co-ownership. What does that mean? Is that in the form of loans? Or, to be clear, again, for Albertans and Canadians watching, like, is there any taxpayer money going into this thing?
Well, I can tell you the approach that we've taken, which I'm pleased to see that other provinces and the federal government have replicated, is offering loan guarantees. One of the insights that my predecessor, Jason Kenney, had was that one of the reasons why bands are not able to take on ownership stakes is because they need a bank to ensure that they will underwrite the loan. And that's what we step in with. We do it through our Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. We have the ability to underwrite up to $3 billion in loan guarantees. We're about $750 million right now on a variety of projects. And that's what we would put towards this, is the offer of a loan guarantee. I think the British Columbia government has something similar. The federal government does as well. But that has proven successful, especially on these kinds of projects that have a long-term revenue stream associated with tolling once they're up and running.
But that's the limit to the backstop that you would provide with taxpayer dollars, correct? Like, it would come in that form. It would not be through any other means to fund the construction of a pipeline.
That would be the intention, definitely.
The intention, or what will actually happen?
Well, Look, Coastal GasLink is partially owned by AIMCO. The Caisse de dépôt et placement owns a portion of the DP World ports. So there have been instances in the past where various pension funds have come in and also had a portion of various pipeline infrastructure and other projects, as long as they're profitable and have a revenue stream. But those decisions aren't made by me; they're made by the various pension fund managers that we have.
You referenced a conversation with Premier Eby last night, as well as Premier trilateral talks. The MOU talks about engagement with coastal First Nations, as well as, or First Nations more largely, as well as the province of British Columbia. I have to ask, look, I've conducted a number of interviews with the Premier of British Columbia on this subject. The one thing that confounds me is why he wasn't brought into the discussions earlier. Did you and the Prime Minister put the prospect of this project at risk by not bringing him and coastal First Nations into the fold earlier? And if so, why?
Well, I know I've done many conversations with you where I think every press conference, every time I was asked about this, I said that we were in conversations with the federal government over this, that we were going back and forth, that we had multiple different drafts, that we had a negotiating team. I've been talking about that for months. So the reason why we had to is most of the elements of this deal are related to Alberta. Removing the emissions cap was vitally important for us to get all projects going ahead. Getting the carve out on the clean electricity regs, that applies to Alberta because 90% of our power grid is natural gas, and various other elements. The greenwashing bill to be able to get that also repealed. So there were a number of things that we had to do here to restore confidence in developing the production side of the business, but also restore confidence in being able to deploy new electricity infrastructure as well. So most of the MOU deals with creating an investment climate for Alberta. And then the federal government, as you know, is solely responsible for cross-border infrastructure, including pipelines. That's been litigated before. And I'm glad to see that the Prime Minister has an intention to work with us on that.
And I take your point about a large part of this applying to your province, but there's another big part, if this pipeline does go ahead, that clearly applies to British Columbia, including the potential removal or exemption. I know the language is very specific in the document around the tanker ban. The point that Premier Eby has made is that even speculation around that has put very real, as he characterizes it, projects around LNG at risk, because coastal First Nations have supported those projects because there is a tanker ban. I have heard you on multiple occasions talk about the imposition of laws that you consider bad and put investments in your province at risk. Why would you participate in a process that does the same for another premier? Can you understand how he feels?
Well, I believe in the Constitution, and so I know things that are intra-provincial projects are the responsibility of the province, but ports are federal jurisdiction, cross-border pipelines and transmission lines are federal jurisdiction, and trade and commerce is federal jurisdiction. You cannot have a province blocking access of another landlocked province to get their products to market. That's been determined by the courts. And so we're very pleased to already start the consultation and with the nations, including coastal First Nations. I had a very pleasant conversation with the Haisla chief yesterday, and they made it very clear that they're open to all kinds of work with Alberta on all kinds of products, maybe not as enthusiastic about bitumen, but they're also excited about expanding LNG and also expanding additional export opportunities. So I would say I have not experienced what Premier Eby has described. I haven't heard a single nation that we've engaged with in British Columbia say that they're going to trade off one against the other. They're letting us know what their perspectives are. We're pleased for that. And we're going to keep on working with them to see if we can put together a consortium that will also be able to own a portion of this new line.
I have seen, some of those First Nations put out specific statements, but with respect to what you said about the federal jurisdiction here, I do take your point on their constitutional ability with interprovincial projects, but I also remember many times when you have not believed in the Constitution as it applies that way, when you have fought against, for example, decisions to impose carbon pricing, even though the Supreme Court dictated that that was in federal jurisdiction. Again, I'll put to you, is the project not more at risk because BC and those coastal First Nations were not brought into the fold earlier?
I don't think so. I mean, I've not heard any nation say they're going to cancel their support for LNG Canada 2.0 because of any conversations Alberta's having. I just don't think that's true. But what I will say is that we respect the Constitution and also the Supreme Court. They did make a decision that the federal government does have the right to set floor prices on CO2, which is why that forms a basis for our agreement. We have a tier agreement. It's our approach to how we do carbon pricing, which we've been doing, incidentally, since 2007. So other jurisdictions have followed us, sometimes by decades, and we have to work collaboratively with the federal government. That's why that is part and parcel in the agreement, that we'll come to a stringency agreement and figure out what the top rate would be. We want to have a balance of making sure that it's going to support the investment in carbon capture technology, but also not be punitive to our industry, so that we have the ability to invest in those things. So I think that's what it's about when you have an agreement. There are certain commitments and undertakings we have to do, and there's certain commitments and undertakings that the federal government has to do. But I was very pleased to see that they've made great movement on the lion's share of the 9 bad laws that we put on the table.
I will say, like, you're saying carbon price floor is okay from the federal government. You weren't saying that for a lot of years. That is a very different position that you're taking now, because it appears to benefit other projects. Will you keep the increase, the 6-fold increase the Prime Minister just described when it comes to the industrial carbon price, even if another bitumen pipeline doesn't go ahead?
Well, I think, again, that's not true, Vashi. We had a tier agreement before I came in that agreed that we would increase the price on CO2 for industrial emitters up to $170 per ton by 2030. We paused it this year because with the changes that we've seen in the world, the disruption in energy markets, we knew that price going that high that quickly was going to be harmful to our industry. And now we're in a negotiation with the Prime Minister about what that is going to look like. So I hope we can come to an agreement where we've identified April 1st as a time for when we're going to announce what that agreement would look like. There's going to be some more negotiations that have to take place, but that's part of what happens when Canada and Alberta work together. I think we both benefit. Not everybody gets 100% of what they want, but I can tell you that we certainly moved the dial on many of the things that we did want to start getting investment from the private sector back into our province again.
The Prime Minister just said that the industrial carbon price would increase, the effective, I think he said, rate of it by 6-fold. I just want to be clear. Well, I'll ask the question again, Premier. If, in fact, a bitumen pipeline does not go ahead to the West Coast, will you still agree to increase the industrial price on carbon as it applies to your province?
Well, as I said, it's a negotiation. I don't think if you look at the agreement, it doesn't talk about $1,000 carbon price in the agreement. It talks about $130 carbon price, and that's what we're looking at. So I would say that we have an agreement in place. We've got some parameters that we've put in there. There is no veto for any province. There is some acknowledgement that the price has to go up, but there's also an acknowledgement that that's going to be a negotiation. I'm looking forward to that.
Is it contingent on a pipeline going ahead in your view?
Well, I think what you've seen in the agreement is that the Pathways project going ahead is contingent on a pipeline to the Asian markets going ahead, and vice versa. The pipeline has to go ahead for Pathways to go ahead as well, and we're going to work on stage gating both of those things so they happen at the same time.
I didn't mean the Pathways, my apologies. I mean the industrial price on carbon.
We've always had an industrial price on carbon since 2007.
The increase, apologies, the increase, Premier.
Well, as I said, we're going to be negotiating that on April the 1st. We have to make sure it's at a level that is going to continue to keep our projects and our market competitive. You have to remember that in the rest of the world, most of the countries have a target of 2050. So I was pleased to see that we've moved to that same target of 2050 without having any interim targets. China, I believe, has a 2060 target. India has a 2070 target. And that, I think, is more in keeping with the idea that we have to give industry enough time to be able to invest and develop the technologies in order to make that achievable. But yes, there's an acceptance that we know $95 is not where it's going to stay, and that it is going to rise. But the level that it's going to rise, how quickly and to what level, that remains a subject of negotiation that we'll have with Canada in due course, and hopefully have an announcement on April the 1st.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. A pleasure as always, Premier. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Vashi.
Thanks. Danielle Smith is the Premier of Alberta. We're going to leave our special coverage there, but we'll have a whole lot more throughout the afternoon on this significant memorandum of understanding between the province of Alberta and the Prime Minister. The federal government will also speak to Federal Natural Resources and Energy Minister Tim Hodgson tonight at 5 o'clock Eastern on Power Play. Hope you can join me then. Thanks so much for watching this afternoon. Our coverage continues right here on CTV News Channel.
As we follow this major story on this Thursday, we're bringing you special coverage before the break. This big agreement between Alberta and the federal government on a plan to build a new pipeline, a so-called memorandum of understanding to get Alberta oil to new markets in Asia through British Columbia. What's being called a reset of relations between Alberta and the federal government. The beginning of a project that would take years but could result in a new pipeline for the province, something Alberta's been asking for many, many years. A number of key things have to happen here, and some of the takeaways. Private companies and investors have to get involved, but take a look. This was the signing by Mark Carney and Danielle Smith. A lot of smiles there as they signed the agreement. Private investors have to get involved to actually build the pipeline. British Columbia has to be part of the discussions. First Nations in areas that would be affected by a new pipeline have to be part of the discussions, and environmental conditions have to be met. All of this, of course, part of Canada's larger goal to become an energy superpower and diversify energy exports away from being so dependent on the United States to other markets like Asia, maybe even Europe. A lot of positivity and enthusiasm by the Prime Minister and the Premier of Alberta on what lies ahead. And we'll have extensive coverage throughout the day on that story right here on CTV News Channel. Some other headlines we're following for you on this Thursday. Let's get to it. A new report on healthcare is estimating costs are going to skyrocket. Healthcare spending in Canada will increase by more than 4% in 2025, projected to reach about $400 billion. CTV's Scott Hurst is standing by with more in our national newsroom. And this report saying health spending is expected to not only exceed Canada's economic growth, but of course, inflation and population increases also driving this.
Todd, rising costs are a reality as you